from another ID from my phone, make me co-host there as
Sure, sure, sure. A very good evening to all our participants. We thank you for joining us on this special webinar on the threadbare analysis of the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. The special address for today's session will be delivered by none other than legal luminary, Senior Advocate Kapil Sibal, who will share his experiences while dealing with money laundering cases. Kapil sir completed his LLM in 1977 from the prestigious Harvard Law School. He was designated as a senior lawyer in 1983. Over the years, Sir has built a highly successful legal career that included an appointment in 1989 as the Additional Solicitor General of India. Moreover, between 1995 and 2002,
I see, why don't you stop all this and let's start the talk, no?
I just set the context in a minute, sir.
I don't think
Kapil ji absolutely does not need any introduction whatsoever to our audience.
No, I'm just a colleague. I'm just a colleague of the
no,
legal
sir,
fraternity
but just
and a friend of everybody who's around. That's about it.
But if I could just take 30 seconds, sir, as the group editor of Tax Sutra to do some a warm welcome. I would say only this: it's an honor for us to be hosting a legal luminary of the stature of Kapil ji on this webinar. There are very few lawyers. I have covered 16 years of legal journalism from CNBC and Bloomberg, and I've covered high courts and Supreme Courts now for 16 years. Very few lawyers in this country, you can take it on your fingertips, who can straddle constitution law, civil law, criminal law, corporate law, and the new commercial laws, including laws like competition law, with effortless ease. Not only that, on each branch of law, Kapil ji actually is one of the principal reasons why we have jurisprudence, and the jurisprudence which has evolved. Someone who's seen the law evolve over the last 30, 40 years, and one of the branches of law which has evolved like no other law is economic crime. If you've looked at the last 5 to 10 years, the number of economic crime cases that have come up, senior IRS officers now getting posted to enforcement directorate, and one of them, who's a Tax Sutra subscriber, told us a few days ago that the prosecutions are going up and the ED is, ramping up, or it's upping its ante. The way the economic crimes has come up, be it SFIO, company law, CBI, the economic offenses wing of the police in various states. Look at a case like DS Kulkarni, a 1,200 crore deposits of depositors of a big real estate company, which went bust in Maharashtra. And you have multiple agencies going after the same case. The EOW, you have the company law tribunal, which is going through it. And then you have the SFIO now on it. And on top of it, you have the Maharashtra Depositors Protection Act. And that means that you have to traverse so many laws carefully. And it also means that if, for example, somewhere you miss dotting the I's or crossing the T's on any of these laws, or are in just a thin violation also on some of these economic crime legislations, you could be in for trouble. Who better than Kapil ji to tell us some of the nuances of this legislation, how he's seen it evolve, his take on it. And Kavita, maybe before Kapil ji begins, a 10-second warm welcome from you, please.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you so much. Sir, I'll be failing in my duty, frankly speaking. And in fact, I told Arun that give me 30 seconds before Kapil sir actually starts. Everybody is aware that so far Mr. Sibal is concerned, he is a brilliant lawyer, no dispute about this. And I had the chance to, in fact, assist him in many matters before High Court and Supreme Court. And apart from his legal argument, and apart from the way he argues, the way he handles, a very, very witty lawyer, and his sense of humor is extremely, extremely great. So if you're working, if you have anybody who gets a chance to work and assist him in a particular matter, I think it is a good fortune. So I'll say I'm really fortunate enough that I've assisted him in few matters. And I look forward to working with him in many more matters. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us here, for coming here, giving your, it will be everybody's, I think everybody will be highly, everybody will be going home very happy, learning from you. So a very, very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, let's start off. Thanks a lot for those very warm words, Kavita. I have to say that this particular legislation, and I'll give you my thoughts on it, worries me a great deal. Because, you know, before I start on the act itself, let me just preface this by saying that all laws have salutary objectives. You take any law in this country, it has a salutary objective, because when we sit in parliament and when we get a feedback on the problems that society is facing in any walk of life, parliament comes up with legislation. And the intent of the legislation is always salutary. It's always good. The objective is to serve the larger public interest. But in the process of its implementation, somewhere down the road, it gets corrupted. And that's not true of just the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, the PMLA, but it's true of all laws. So the measure of any democracy is that both the substantive as well as the procedural fairness that is necessary in the implementation of the law must be in place. And if it is not in place, then law becomes an instrument of oppression. And when law becomes an instrument of oppression, it loses its value in terms of the objectives for which it was put in place. That's true of PMLA, that's true of all laws. And I think whenever any professional or anybody listening looks at a law, please don't look at it in the context of what the cold print says. Look at it in the context of how it is implemented. Now, let me start off by saying that this whole PMLA came about why? It came about by virtue of a UN convention, the UN Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances, which is a convention of 1988. And today there are 191 parties to it. And it became effective on November 11, 1990. Essentially, what was the reason behind it? Nations were worried about the use of drug money, the use of psychotropic substances, and the laundering of that money across borders, within borders and across borders, and the use of banking channels in legitimizing laundered money. And therefore, the convention said that we must take, and of course, this then was used by drug lords. It was used for destroying the lives of youth around the world. So it was a very salutary purpose. But in Article 3 of that convention, and I'd like to read that to you, said, subject to its constitutional principles and the basic concepts of its legal system, each party, that means each nation, shall adopt such measures as may be necessary to establish as a criminal offense under its domestic law when committed intentionally the possession, purchase, or cultivation of narcotic drugs or psychotropic substances for personal consumption, contrary to the provisions of the 1961 Convention, and the 1961 Convention is amended in the 1971 Convention. That's the purpose of the Act. But when you look at the provisions of this Act, what do you realize? That it has very little to do with drugs and psychotropic substances. And if you look at the schedule of the Act, and I'll come to that in a minute, it deals with all kinds of legislation, from intellectual property to information technology, to the Stamp Act, to the Wildlife Protection Act, to all kinds of legislation, to the codes, to the penal code, all kinds of legislation. So basically, the intent of the law was to deal with a particular kind of crime. As it is sought to be implemented today, it seeks to deal with all kinds of crime. And the provisions of the law, which are extremely harsh, are now applied to ordinary crimes. And that makes the whole legislation, according to me, unconstitutional. Now, let us understand, because the law says that any proceeds of a crime, if it comes into your hands and you treat those proceeds of crime which are illegal and you project it as untainted money, because it's tainted money when it comes into your hand. But when you project it as untainted money, the crime is committed. So if somebody takes a bribe puts it into an account, right, in a bank. Now, the bribe is taken illegally, so it's tainted money. The moment that it's put into an account, it becomes, you try to project it as untainted. Why? Because it has gone into the normal banking channel. So you go into a restaurant, let's put it this way, you go into a restaurant, you pay cash. You may have got cash from a bribe. Now, you pay cash, that cash is put into, the restaurant owner puts it into his bank account. He doesn't know whether it's tainted or untainted money. He has no idea, right? Or a crime is committed and a professional is paid. I send a bill, a crime stands committed. It so happens that the person who pays my bill pays it through means that are corrupt. I don't know about it. I have no idea. My bill is paid. And this can be multiplied in, with various examples. Take, for example, an educational institution. I set up an educational institution with an investment of, say, 5 crores. In that, 25 lakhs is cash. Assume it's tainted money. Now, that institution is set up. Students are admitted. Fees are paid by the student. And under the PMLA, somebody gets wind of the fact that 25 lakhs or 50 lakhs of this money was tainted. So they'll get into the act. And every year, that particular institution makes a lot of money. So under this act, it's not just the 25 or the 50 lakhs that is subject to attachment or subject to proceedings, but it's the entire proceeds that get mixed up with legitimate investment. So that if I buy shares through tainted money and that person A sells shares to B, sells shares to C, sells shares to D, all along the line, money in the hands of these shareholders are all tainted and they don't know about it. That's the extent of illegality that is so apparent by virtue of the provisions of the act and the manner in which they are implemented. So let's just go into the nitty-gritty now. This act defines what is called proceeds of crime. And proceeds of crime are part of the definition. Let me just give you the definition of proceeds of crime just that you understand. Proceeds of crime means what? Any property derived or obtained directly or indirectly by any person as a result of criminal activity, or where such property is taken or held outside the country than the property equivalent in value held within the country or abroad. So therefore, any property, proceeds of crime is any property derived or obtained directly or indirectly by any person. So I may obtain it directly or I may obtain it indirectly. In other words, it may be directly obtained from a person who has committed the crime, and the person who received it has given it on to another person, and that is indirectly obtained. But in the hands of another person who has no knowledge that a crime has been committed and that these monies represent proceeds of crime, it is proceeds of crime even in his hands, in terms of the definition. And it relates to property, and property too is defined. So property includes property of all kinds. Any property, assets, corporeal, incorporeal, movable, immovable, tangible, intangible, includes deeds, instruments, evidencing title, all kinds of property. So proceeds of crime relate to property. Proceeds of crime may be received directly or indirectly. So down the line, it may relate to any form of property. That's the expanse of the act. But this proceeds of crime must relate to what? To what is called a scheduled offense. What do you mean by a scheduled offense? An offense that is part of the schedule of the PMLA Act, of the Money Laundering Act, which is now Schedule A, Schedule B, Schedule C. Now, and that's defined. The schedule means the schedule of this act. Okay. Now, what is then the offense? This is the definition of proceeds of crime. The offense is whosoever directly or indirectly attempts to indulge or knowingly assists, or knowingly is a party or is actually involved in any process or activity connected with proceeds of crime, including its concealment, possession, acquisition, or use, and projecting or claiming it as untainted property, shall be guilty of the offense of money laundering. So, proceeds of crime must be in relation to a scheduled offense. Now, take for example 420. 420 is a provision in the penal code which is included as a scheduled offense. Now, I make an allegation, A makes an allegation against B that, look, I bought this property, the guy cheated me, the guy was supposed to give me X amount of money, he gave me less, this was my understanding. Immediately, an offense under the IPC under 420 will be, an FIR would be lodged, and it is also prosecutable under PMLA. So immediately, and you don't have, the person making the allegation doesn't have to prove anything. He just have to lodge the FIR. The FIR has to be registered. That's about it. Because the moment an FIR is registered, a crime allegedly a crime has been committed prima facie, qua a cognizable offense. And the PMLA comes into the picture, right? Now, a new explanation has been added to this in 2019, which says that for the removal of doubts, it is hereby clarified that a person shall be guilty of offense of money laundering if such person is found to have directly or indirectly attempted to indulge or knowingly assisted or knowingly is a party or is actually involved in one or more of the following processes or activities connected with proceeds of crime, namely concealment, possession, or acquisition or use. So if I am in possession of money that I don't know is untainted, in terms of the explanation, I am also, my money in my hands is also liable to be confiscated. And it doesn't matter when the crime, because remember, 420 was added in the schedule much later, recently, 2009, I think. Right? Now, I may have, this is now also perceived to be a continuing offense. In other words, in the PMLA, 420 was included on a particular date by a notification. It becomes proceeds of crime even after 2009, it is proceeds of crime, but for offenses that may have been committed prior to 2009. Because I am in possession. The explanation says if you are in possession of proceeds of crime, and I'm using those proceeds of crime. So it may not have been a crime at the time when I received that money, but because I'm in possession of that money in 2009, assuming that the notification came on that day for including 420 in the schedule, then I'm in possession of those proceeds of crime. So limitation has no bearing under the PMLA. No bearing at all. Because on the date of the notification, I may be in possession of proceeds of crime. And so I'm liable to be dealt with, or that money in my hands is liable to be dealt with. Now, which country in the world has this kind of an offense? It is unthinkable. What is the PMLA? I mean, in the hands of a dishonest officer or a corrupt officer or a motivated investigation, it is premeditated loot by an authority. PMLA, premeditated loot by an authority. That's what it is. If it's in the hands of the wrong man implementing the proceedings under this. And I have dealt with case after case, where people who are just completely uninvolved, who have nothing to do with the activity, are dealt with by these authorities. And I gave you the example of the educational institution. It happened in Assam. A gentleman made an investment in an educational institution in Assam, and an FIR was lodged because why? Because in Assam, while setting up the institution, he did not pay certain people. So an FIR was registered against him, and this whole process started against him under the PMLA. And the result was that the fees of the students that the institution got was attached. So in a sense, you can stop economic activity, which makes no sense. We've heard of individuals, and I've dealt with the case of many individuals, where merely on account of an FIR being lodged, you don't have to wait for the charge sheet being filed. You don't have to wait for a complaint being made. The proceedings under the PMLA start. So the FIR is not investigated, but in the meantime, all the properties are attached. Ultimately, it may result in no crime having been committed, but just imagine the loss that it causes to economic life of an individual or of an entity, because this applies. I mean, there are several chartered accountants sitting here. Imagine, when people come to you for investment of money, how do you know that money is tainted or untainted? You're not an investigating officer. You're a chartered accountant. So you invest that money, you invest it in shares. And the shares are transferred from one party to another. And it comes to light at a particular given point in time that that money that you invested was tainted property. How did you know? How are you going to protect yourself? And any amount that you got in terms of that transaction would also be tainted. And then if you are part of a large conglomerate, then it's an offense by the company as well, because you happen to be a partner of that company. So as a chartered accountant, proceeding will start against you by your peers under the Act itself. And then, of course, you have the Companies Act. Those proceedings will start. Then the SFIO will come in. Then there'll be offenses under the Companies Act under 447. Then prosecution will start. For what? For something that you handled, which you thought didn't know was untainted, but which was tainted, which became untainted in your hands because you gave advice for investment. How do you then protect yourself? How will economic activity move forward if this is the way in which laws are going to be interpreted and implemented? You cannot advise your clients, because you may well be, which is why foreign investment will not come, because if foreign companies are here and they are subject to this law, as they would be and they should be, then they too will expose themselves. Why would anybody make an investment? Why would anybody? And this is happening now. I'm handling, cases of chartered accountants under the Companies Act because of these kind of moment the Companies Act proceedings move forward, it'll become a PMLA proceeding as well. So I think that as chartered accountants who are sitting here, you will have to tell your clients, whoever comes, that you please must fill up a particular performer to make sure that as far as you are concerned, you did not know that this is tainted money. At least you should protect yourself and get an indemnity. Something like that. I think some procedures must be followed by you to protect yourself. And there must be some, when a forward transaction is made in terms of that money itself, I think some protection will also be provided to the investor who sort of uses that money for further investments. So down the line, you should not be exposed to proceedings under the PMLA. And this concept of a continuing offense is unknown to law, nowhere in the world. I mean, a criminal offense, you are liable to be prosecuted for having committed that offense on the date when the offense is notified. It can't be a continuing offense merely because at the time when it was not an offense, you were in possession of certain monies which happened to be proceeds of crime, when it was not a crime. And yet the explanation now in 2019 says it will be deemed to be a crime because it will be deemed to be a continuing offense. The reason why this explanation was brought is because we argued several cases in court that criminal laws can't have retrospective effect. So proceeds of crime will only be looked at the time when that particular offense is notified under the schedule. And so legislature thought, and I think mindlessly, that now it's time to say that, look, it doesn't really matter when the offense was notified. It'll be an offense even prior to that date. and therefore money is in your hands prior to that date will be liable to confiscation and liable to attachment. So, okay, so an FIR is filed, PMLA proceedings start because an ECIR is filed. And now there's an absolutely horrendous judgment emerging from a particular high court where proceedings were taken under the Income Tax Act, and the offense under the Income Tax Act, which is part of a scheduled offense. And I just, if we look at Part C, the only offense is willful attempt to evade any tax, penalty, or interest referred to in Section 51 of the Black Money, Undisclosed Foreign Income and Assets and Imposition of Tax Act. Right? That's the only part, that's the only aspect of tax which is subject to prosecution under this Act. So we had a case in a particular high court where there was a proceeding under the Income Tax Act, I think it was 276 of the Act. And we said that 276 is not a scheduled offense. And therefore those proceedings have to be quashed because those proceedings are null and void because under the PMLA, no notice could have been issued to the person concerned because 276 is not part of the schedule under this. And the court said it really doesn't matter, contrary to the definition. So the problem in this country is not only are investigations motivated, but courts of law are also not alive to the consequences that this can have on economic activity and on the lives of individuals and on the constitutional rights that all of us have. And see the kind of offenses that have been included in the schedule. I mean, offenses under the Information Technology Act. Breach of confidentiality and privacy is an offense, incidentally. Now, these 59 Chinese companies, apps that have been banned on grounds of breach of confidentiality, because they say that the data that they possess can be mined by China, right? Now, that's an offense under the IT Act. So from any standpoint, they're liable to prosecution under the PMLA. And so all their properties can be attached. All the properties of the 15 apps that are generated in India could be liable to be attached. That's the nature of the act and the expansive nature of this particular legislation. And see the other Trademarks Act. Penalty for applying for a false trademark. Penalty for selling goods or providing services to which false trademark or false trade description is applied. Now, these are offenses under the Trademarks Act. There's seldom prosecutions are taking place, but they also become offenses under the PMLA. So people will be very, very hesitant to do any economic activity if under this act proceedings are undertaken in the fashion that they are being undertaken. I mean, you claim that an individual has X properties outside the country, right? You lodge an FIR, you have no knowledge in the sense that you have no hard evidence of those properties. You cannot pinpoint that those properties belong to X, yet an FIR is lodged against X. Once the FIR is lodged, proceedings under PMLA start, though no investigation takes place under the FIR, by virtue of the FIR. Proceedings under PMLA start, then you start attaching his properties in India. Because you can't get your get at the properties abroad. So you start sending letters rogatory under the Code of Criminal Procedure to find out what those properties are. That will take years. In the meantime, the equivalence of those properties can be attached in India. So all the properties of the gentleman are then attached in India while the FIR is not being investigated and all this happening under the PMLA. So therefore, if this happens to an entity, the business will be stopped. And so I can give you some very, very interesting examples. Offenses under the Customs Act, evasion of duty. So an evasion of duty becomes an offense under the PMLA. Anyway, so enough said about this aspect of the matter. Then comes that how this process of attachment takes place. Because there's a provision in the Act which says that that while these investigations are pending, properties can be attached. So a provisional attachment order is issued by the concerned officer. And the deputy director or the director can, before any proceedings are taken, can immediately attach those properties except that he has to give reasons. You can challenge that order, that provisional attachment order, because you're given notice for 30 days to challenge that order. So you can challenge that order before an authority. But most of the time, the authorities do not look at the reasons why this attachment has been made. Because this Act says that if you want to attach the properties, you can attach them by giving reasons. That there are reasonable grounds to believe that if I don't pass an order of provisional attachment, the properties will be frittered away. So what those reasons are hardly ever adjudicated upon. Now, at that stage, when that order of provisional attachment is passed and reasons are given, those reasons must be demonstrably proved to be correct before such an attachment is made. But very few authorities even look at that issue. So the attachment becomes, final. And then, of course, you have to await the outcome of the proceedings before the property can be confiscated or goes to the government of India in the event you are convicted. Now, that conviction will take 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 11 years, I don't know, because many cases just linger on. Many cases, of course, are also motivated. So then what happens is that your attachment continues. So you can't deal with the property. So the economic activity stops. This can happen to individuals, it can happen to companies, it can happen to chartered accountancy firms, it can happen to anybody, because a person is also defined in the Act. And a person in the Act includes any and everybody. I'll just give you that definition, which is also very interesting. It includes a Hindu undivided family. It includes everybody. A karta, it includes any entity, it includes a company, a firm, an association of persons, a body of individuals, incorporated, not incorporated, a juristic person, an agency, an office, or branch owned or controlled by any of the above persons, a Hindu undivided family. So the definition of person is also expansive. So, okay, so then the attachment is made. Now, the attachment is made, of course, in the course of proceedings, as you know, they can enter your house, they can carry out an inspection, they can call you, they can record your statement. And when they record your statement, they are deemed to be statements under 93 of the code, which means that they are a court of law. In other words, that statement will be admissible in evidence. That's the other dangerous part of this Act. So that this record your statement, that's admissible in evidence against you. And the burden of proof is also, the Act says that you will have to show that you are innocent. So the burden of proof is shifted from the prosecution to the accused. And unless he shows that he is innocent, it will be impossible to discharge that burden. So that's the other problem in the Act. And then comes the bail provisions, of course, which were struck down by the Supreme Court Justice Nariman judgment in Nikesh. And he said that the entire Act, he struck down section 45(1), because 41(5)(1). And the reason why he struck down was very, very interesting, for the reason that I have given you. He says, look, something may be proceeds of crime in my hand, right? Because the first transactions takes place between A and B. A commits a crime, B is in possession of proceeds of crime, but B then transfers it to C, who does not know whether this is tainted money or not. But C also is an accused. So C also is then, will not get bail, because the court will only grant bail if the prosecutor is given notice and the judge comes to the conclusion that I am innocent of the offense. How will a judge ever come to a conclusion that I have not committed the offense? Before the investigation is over, or before the charge sheet, the trial is over, he can never be convinced, which means I'll never get bail. So the Supreme Court Justice Nariman, in a landmark judgment in Nikesh, said that this is unconstitutional. I will not allow this to happen. Of course, they have now amended it, and the amendment has also been challenged in a sense, and it has been interpreted by several high courts to mean that that the amendment doesn't cure what was decided by the Supreme Court, and therefore the bail provision is still, as struck down by the Supreme Court. Then the last thing that I wanted to mention was that in these circumstances, now, as I said to you, the objectives are extremely salutary. I mean, we have to deal with money laundering if it is part of organized crime. We have to deal with drug money. We have to deal with terrorism, and we have to deal with all money laundering activities with respect to terrorism or forms of pornography which are not acceptable, or any kind of very serious noxious activity, psychotropic substances where the lives of young people are destroyed. And I think that we need very strong laws to deal with that. But if you deviate from that objective and you start implementing the law and implement it in such a fashion that allows you to impact the economy of the country, then the law itself becomes an obstacle to progress. And therefore, I think that such laws, even though legislated for a salutary purpose, actually, in the larger interests of the scheme of things, have been an impediment in the economic progress of India. And I think as a democracy, and we are moving slowly and slowly away from it, we need to protect the values on the basis of which our forefathers gave to us a constitution where personal liberty, where all the fundamental rights that go with personal liberty had to be protected. And the way in which people are being arrested, prosecuted, not granted bail, under the Act, the last thing I want to mention, all intermediaries are also liable in this process. Any intermediary in the course of a transaction is also equally liable, whether he knows about it or he doesn't know about it, because he happens to be in possession or happens to have aided without intent the dealing with proceeds of crime. One day, I think this act has to be challenged. I believe it's unconstitutional, and I hope one day the Supreme Court applies its mind, and we hope to get a judgment that brings about a balance between public interest and the rights of individuals, the right of companies to do business, the right of professionals to carry on their profession without fear or favor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Kapilji, if I know you have to, time is short, but you set the themes on fire. Every time you argue, sir, I am hooked on to my Twitter ID and listening to your arguments either on Live Law or Bar and Bench. Sir, today we have quite a few questions.
Sure. But I have all the time in the world. You don't worry about time.
Kavita, should we take a few questions now and some at the end? Is that fine, Kavita?
It is as per the convenience of sir. I have no problem.
No problem. I'm free for you for a while. Not an issue.
Yeah. So we'll take maybe 3-4 questions now, and then Kavita can start a presentation, and we could come back. Quite a few people eager to ask questions. I'll let my good friend Sagar do the honors first. He's a chartered accountant, now turned lawyer, and a student of economic crimes as well. He's handled some situations practically. Sagar, would you want to pose a question to Kapil sir, please? Tanaya, would you unmute Sagar? Yeah. Yeah.
Sir, thank you so much for the enlightening thoughts. Sir, the question is that there are so many special statutes now dealing with the PMLA or dealing with the Benami properties or even some provisions from the company's law.
Sure.
And the SFIO is very aggressively investigating. So there may be a transaction. There are certain transactions where certain part is covered by PMLA, certain by Companies Act, and even there is overlapping with the Benami Act. How do you look at the overlapping of such offenses covered by various special statutes? How do you think the overlapping will actually operate?
Well, first of all, this issue will have to be decided by courts. But I think as far as the prosecuting agencies are concerned, they think that they are a law unto themselves, that each authority under that special act will use that act for the ends for which the act was legislated. And even if the overlapping is there, I'll give you a small example. Take, for example, the IBC. Right? Under the IBC, there are these liquidation proceedings.
Right.
And there is the company is sold.
Right.
There's a resolution applicant.
Right.
And they have to pay huge amounts of money, sometimes 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 crores. Right.
Right.
And now it is found that the corporate debtor had tainted funds in his hand.
Right.
Which were invested in the company, which is now in the hands of the resolution applicant.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Now, under the PMLA, they attach the properties of the resolution applicant.
Right, sir.
And the resolution applicant says that, look, I have bought this at a cost of 19,000 crores. Now, if you attach the property, I did not know that the corporate debtor had tainted money in his hands.
Right.
So why should I pay 19,000 crores? Because you are taking proceedings against the corporate debtor.
Right.
And the ED is saying, no, this is an independent offense. And because the money is in your hands by using this very statute, therefore I can attach it.
Right.
If this happens, nobody will come forward under the IBC and participate in those proceedings and become a resolution applicant.
Right.
And
Right.
the answer to your question is, it's completely illogical, but that's how authorities are acting.
Right.
Sir, a question which is possibly a continuation comes from one of the audience members who's posted on the chat. Kapil sir, parallel provisions pertaining to prosecution under the PMLA and ancillary laws, whether they are hit by principles of double jeopardy.
No. They say, no, the courts have held PMLA is separate from the penal code. For example, the offense under the penal code is cheating. The offense under PMLA is proceeds of crime. Cheating you'll be punished for cheating under the penal code, but your proceeds of crime will be attached and you'll be prosecuted under PMLA.
Sure.
There are two separate statutes, and therefore there's no overlapping and no double jeopardy.
Yeah. So the next question is your views on the interplay between PMLA and Article 20 and 300A of the Constitution.
You see, 300A only says that nobody will be deprived of his property without authority of law. PMLA is an authority of law. So you can be deprived of your property. There's no problem.
Yeah. So one
Remember,
question.
19(1)(f) was a fundamental right. It's been taken away from fundamental right, was excluded from Article 19, right to property. It's now 300A. So it's not an issue. I don't think that Article 20 will come in. I don't think 300A will come in.
So while reporting on several cases argued by you, especially on economic crimes, which we cover on our portal lawstreetindia.com, of late, sir, we've argued several cases we've reported of yours, where you literally had to labor up to the Supreme Court for bail on economic crimes, and then the triple test and this and that. So this entire jurisprudence on bail, and especially in economic crimes matter, is becoming, is giving corporate India, and this is from the point of view of India Inc. So many corporates are here. I can see people from large corporate groups on this webinar. So it's giving corporate India the jitters as well. And I'll come to the professionals later, but first corporate, sir.
See, it's like this. See, this is not ease of doing business. It is ensuring that you don't do business. If this is the way laws are applied. Remember, in one of my very, very high profile clients, I ultimately got him bail. But on the first occasion, he did not get bail. And the judgment was rendered by a division bench of the Supreme Court. Quite recently, another bench, larger than, of 3 judges, has overruled that, saying that that was wrong law. Right? So this is what is happening in court. You see, we don't have one Supreme Court. We have several Supreme Courts in this country. Because each bench, whether it's a bench of 2 or a bench of 3, renders a judgment for all the judges. And there is no uniformity and no continuity. And the concept of stare decisis doesn't exist anymore. So you have these contradictory orders. So if bail is not, see, bail not jail is the principle of criminal law. And it has been turned on its head. It's now jail, not bail. That's where we are. And if corporate India is to survive, the nature of criminal prosecutions must change. And the attitude of authorities in government must change. You see, the problem, I'll tell you, the heart of the problem in India is the following. You first arrest a person, then you find out what offense he has committed. This is what happens in India. In all liberal democracies, you first find out whether a person has committed an offense and then you arrest him. So we are following the colonial tradition. Because when they were in power, the British ruled India, naturally they first had to arrest persons to make sure that their sort of colonial rule sort of has continuity. So to protect their own power, they used to arrest persons. It's as if that has not changed. You tell me in which liberal democracy, anywhere in Europe, in the UK, in the US, you don't arrest people without evidence. Here you arrest a person, then you record his statement, then you interrogate him, then you find out that, oh, I see from your question, it seems that you have committed this offense.
Yes, sir, I just name a few matters. I mean, they're all in public domain, but look at some big, and then I'm not naming as in ones which are high profile matters, sir, which I'm saying corporate India. So say, for example, investments that came into AirAsia and so on. So many investments are also being looked at very minutely.
Absolutely. Not just that. There was there is this whole Air India issue that came up, where the government of India had contracts with Dubai, with their airlines, with Etihad and others, for the purposes of, getting landing berths in different parts of India. And apparently the allegation was that lots of money was paid. Now instead of making, they can't make people in the government of Dubai as accused. They can't make, people in Doha as accused. They can't make public servants in India as accused. So they make the intermediaries as accused. And the poor man was in jail for several months. And the FIR was lodged without naming the public servants, without naming people outside the country who were part of those transactions, allegedly corrupt transactions. You got hold of the intermediary and you kept him in jail for a year and a half. See, this kind of prosecution is itself tainted. That's why I said to you, the laws may be salutary, but ultimately how are they implemented is the measure of democracy in a country, the manner and method of implementation.
So one question.
No investment will come if this is the way we start implementing our laws.
Yeah, so one question from my stable. So, Competition Commission, you handle a lot of matters.
Yes.
In fact, your son Amit is one of the leading lawyers on competition law, and we've reported a lot of matters argued by Amit. Sir, on the moment they merged COMPAT with NCLAT, the number of judgments on Competition Commission that have come from the appellate tribunal have dwindled to almost single digits a year. Do you think this merger of tribunals was a good idea at all?
Not at all.
It's completely the competition law appellate tribunal decisions have gone for a toss.
Why just a competition law? See the tribunals across the board in India. Perhaps the income tax tribunal may be an exception, but most other tribunals do the bidding of, you know, the powers that be. Most unfortunate, but that's the way it is.
Yeah. Kavita, you want to pose a question or so before we say thanks to Sir Kavita? If you could pose.
No questions for us. So far I am concerned, no questions from sir at the moment, of course.
Yeah. And so if I could ask the final question, sir, in terms of chartered accountants, I am also first a chartered accountant, then a journalist. If you look at recent matters, sir, all of them which we've been reporting on, so many matters where the auditors have been charge sheeted,
Yes, it's
where the auditors have been arrested, and high profile matters, low profile matters.
But you
Auditors
know
also
why?
are now.
You know why? The scam is on top in the ILFS, right? You won't catch those people. It's 90,000 crores, right? You won't catch the people down the line, but you'll get hold of a chartered accountant and say that, why did you not follow principles of accountancy? He may have followed. He probably followed principles of accountancy, but they have to show to the world that they are taking action. So get hold of a chartered accountant. So you jeopardize the entire, that chartered accountant is a partner. I'm doing many of those cases, you know, for Deloitte and many others. And ultimately what happens? The corporation also, I mean, international companies are in jeopardy because of this. Why will anybody want to do business in India? Where will the investment come from? Where will the best practices come from? They won't come. So you are slowly sort of becoming a country where, where investments is, and that's happening today. I mean, there are now reports, not by foreign entities, which say that the most illiberal democracy in the world is India, which is very sad, But when you get these kind of international reports, they go to international investors. And international investors say, why should you come to India in this environment? Which is why we are losing business to Vietnam. We're losing business to some of the neighboring countries. We're losing business to, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Bangladesh. This is a problem.
And so when you talked, when you uttered the word illiberal, I couldn't stop myself from asking the next question. So there is an effort, you see in quite a few cases now where a test of patriotism is being laid down, saying that no one will represent the Chinese apps, no one will represent this organization. Do you think that, is that in the glorious tradition of the bar? So I mean,
there are two aspects to it. Now, whether you represent a corporation or not, there is the legal issue, namely that it's your duty as a lawyer to give advice to whoever asks for it. But the other worrying thing that I see now is professionals on their own publicly stating that we will not appear for a Chinese company. Now, that's also not entirely consistent with standards of professionalism. Why would you have to make such a statement? Professionals don't have to prove that they are patriotic. Forget about nationalism. Basically, patriotism is at the heart of the love for your country. Nationalism is a concept far removed from patriotism. Now, to show that you are nationalistic, why should a professional make a public statement? And why should this be an issue at all? If you can give Kassab, who was a terrorist, if you, under your constitution, give him a lawyer to defend him, that's in the highest traditions of law. Why don't you apply that tradition to Chinese companies? So I am against the concept at all. We may not represent them as another issue. That's a personal issue. But why should there be a public spectacle of it?
Absolute last question. So from my side, there are many more that have come from audience. From my side, last one. So the economic crime, or you look at most, even tax cases are now taking 20 years, 10 years in Supreme Court and all. But economic crimes, so, a person languishes in jail at times for 2-3 years without bail. The hearing goes on for 8-10 years only at the trial stage itself. We even saw, take a case like 2G, which was argued for 6 years, day to day, but it took 6 years before a judgment
What
would
happened
come.
to the case? What happened to the case? In the trial court, it could not be proved. And see the impact of it on the telecom sector. We had 11 to 13 players in each region, in each circle. We are reduced now in effective to only 2 players.
Yeah.
You have Airtel and you have
Reliance, yeah.
Jio. Vodafone is in great difficulty. I mean, their dues are around 40,000 crores that they have to pay. And the Supreme Court proceedings are going on there as well. So the point is, ultimately, you've reduced competition in the process. And there are several proceedings pending now abroad under the bilateral investment treaty, in which claims have been made against the government of India. So ultimately, both by rendering judgments on the coal block issue and cancelling all the coal blocks, see the state of the economy today in the energy sector. We are importing coal at a much higher price, and the coal mines are not being auctioned. And even if they are auctioned, there's no buyer for it. So therefore, the production of coal has suffered, and no investor is going to come in. The same thing in the telecom sector. Which investor will you get in the cabinet? Nobody.
So exactly 2 years ago, the economic survey mentioned that litigation is India's bane. The single biggest impediment to India's economic growth, it said, is enforcement of contracts. And they mentioned, the economic survey said, we have 3.5 crore cases pending from subordinate courts to Supreme Court, sir. So I'm just wondering, sir, something radical like the SCOTUS, the US Supreme Court, whereby you decide only 40 cases a year, you essentially decline most cases that come your way. Do we need to do something really radical, sir, to declog these courts?
Well, personally, my personal opinion is that you should have, first of all, it's very, very unfair to have a Supreme Court sitting in Delhi. Because people from Orissa, people from the Northeast, people from Kerala, people from West Bengal, people far, far away from Delhi don't have the wherewithal to come to the Supreme Court. So we should have 4 regional courts of appeal. And matters should end there. They should be the final courts of appeal, right? That region should comprise of adjacent states so that people can actually move from the High Court to that court of appeal. And then you should have a constitutional court, which should be one court, which means the judgment must come from the court as an entity, not court sitting in benches, where one judge feels one way, the other judge feels another way. Right? That leads to a lot of confusion in the high courts because we don't know which judgment to follow. And it then depends on the judge as to which judgment he wishes to follow. So that brings about confusion in the law. Implementation becomes a problem. For lawyers also, it becomes a problem. We don't know how to advise the client. And the continuity of Supreme Court as an entity in terms of its jurisprudence is also impacted. So I think that we need some kind of radical change. But more important than anything else is that your investigating agencies of any crime must be unbiased, untainted, not motivated by considerations other than the quality of the crime committed, the heinousness of the crime, and fair in the manner in which investigation takes place. I think that is the most crucial part of our legal system. If that is untainted, then delivery of justice also will be untainted. But if that is tainted, it impacts the delivery of justice.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. It's been an honor, sir, to host
you.
to listen to your erudite views. And sir, it's always a pleasure to follow your courtroom arguments, sir. Even on Twitter, we feel that you are setting the court on fire with your arguments.
Thank you. Thank you.
Always
Thanks
a
lot.
pleasure.
Lovely
Absolute
to be
pleasure
with
to
you
have
all.
hosted you, sir.
Lovely to
Thank
be
you
with
so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kavita, for giving me this opportunity. She's the one who.
I think everybody has learned in the process, and you have made my job so easy. You have explained the entire act in such a nice way, in such a simple way. I think it's so far I am now concerned. I think I am feeling much at ease because you have explained the law in such a nice fashion, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Great.
All the best.
Thank you.
God
Thank you
bless
so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Kavita, over to you, Kavita. I think
Thank you.
thoroughly enjoyed the session, and looking
Same
forward to
here.
your talk now. Yeah.
Same here. In fact, sir has made my job very easy. In fact, he has explained the entire act. And the way sir has explained in such a simple language, I think every entire audience, everybody here, whoever is present, must be benefited by this. Good evening to each and everyone who is present here. And I'll be failing in my duty if I don't start at the very beginning. So I'll start at the very beginning, but then yes, the points which sir has already covered, I won't labor hard on that. And then I will, after a couple of things which I really want to stress on because that is important. And I feel there are some dissections which are required. There's certain things which we need to talk about it. So I'll be dealing with those provisions and then we'll come to the case study. And then in the case study, there is a twist. There is something very interactive thing which we have planned to do. So let us start at the very beginning. So sir has already explained, so I am not explaining what is money laundering. So as per the definition, sir has already explained. So there are basically 3 steps involved in money laundering. Those 3 steps are like it's placement, layering and integration. So what is placement? So placement is basically, placement involves introduction of the proceeds of crime into the financial system. For example, large amounts of cash are broken into smaller sums and deposited directly into banks accounts or transferring of cash overseas for depositing in banking or financial institution, etc. Now the second step is layering. So layering involves use of complex layers of financial transactions to distance the illicit proceeds from their source to disguise the audit trail. Funds are usually moved to offshore centers through front companies. These companies hide the real owner. These companies lend back the proceeds in form of loans, gifts, etc. in disguised forms. And the third step, which is it's called integration. So this involves investment in legitimate economy so that the money gets the color of legitimacy. Money may be invested in real estate, business, etc. Now, Money Laundering Act was introduced in India in 2003. It came into force in 1st July 2005. The main objectives are to prevent and control money laundering, to confiscate and seize the property obtained from the laundered money, and to deal with any other issues connected with money laundering in India. The enforcement of PMLA is done by the Enforcement Directorate and who investigates into the offense of money laundering. Now, proceeds of crime. Proceeds of crime, in fact, sir has explained it very well, but I'll just be explaining, I'll just be not dealing with this particular definition per se, because he's also explained that there was an explanation which was inserted with effect from 1st August 2019. So for this explanation is concerned, it says that for removal of doubts, it is hereby clarified that proceeds of crime includes not only derived or obtained from the schedule offense, but also any property which may directly or indirectly be derived or obtained as a result of any criminal activity relatable to the scheduled offense. So scheduled offense is defined under section 2Y. So there are offenses mentioned in part A, part B or part C of the schedule of the PMLA. So the schedule lists selected offenses under the different laws as Indian Penal Code, Prevention of Corruption Act, Customs Act. PMLA is thus triggered due to commission of a scheduled offense. Thus, these are predicate offenses. If proceedings are commenced under the laws mentioned in the schedule, say for example, Prevention of Corruption Act 1988, then proceedings can be initiated under PMLA for offense of money laundering. Now, property has also been defined under 2B. So property means any property or assets of every description, whether corporeal or incorporeal, movable, immovable, tangible, intangible, and includes deeds and instruments evidencing title or interest in such property, assets, wherever located. So as per the explanation, property includes property of every kind used in the commission of an offense under this act or any scheduled offenses. So it's important to talk about this, since this is the heart of the entire act, PMLA, proceeds of crime. So this basically wanted to dissect this particular section and explain. So there are three limbs. There are three limbs of section 2(1)(u) of the PMLA, namely, limb 1 talks about any property derived or obtained directly or indirectly as a result of criminal activity relating to a scheduled offense. Limb 2 is defined as value of property derived or obtained from criminal activity, and limb 3, property equivalent in value held in India or outside, where property obtained or derived from criminal activity is taken or held outside the country. Now, there have been various judgments of various high courts interpreting limb 2 and limb 3, and some of these judgments conflict with each other. So broadly, what is the issue? The issue is whether limb 2 and limb 3 should be treated at par. So limb 3 basically says that in case of the proceeds of a crime from a scheduled offense is taken out of India, then any property in India of an equivalent value will be treated as proceeds of crime. So the question that arose before various high courts is whether the same analogy extends to limb 2 also. In other words, in cases where the proceeds from a scheduled offense are laundered and retained in India itself, then can any other property equivalent value be treated as proceeds of crime? Some high courts such as Punjab and Haryana High Court, Andhra Pradesh High Court held that these two limbs are different and analogy of limb 3 cannot be applied to 2. They have held that phrase value of such property includes only property which have direct or indirect link with the property derived or obtained from commission of scheduled offense, that is the alleged criminal activity. However, there is a contrary view of Delhi High Court which says the value of such property and property equivalent in value held within country are at par. So this particular section per se will have a lot of interpretational issues, and this is still not free from doubts. So I just mentioned about the Punjab Haryana High Court, the Delhi High Court, and the Andhra Pradesh High Court. So all these courts have taken Punjab Haryana High Court in Seema Garg, Satyam, and Andhra Pradesh High Court in Satyam Computers. They have taken a view which says that both the limbs have to be separate, independently interpreted. But so far Delhi High Court is concerned, they have interpreted that value of such property and property equivalent in value held within the country is at par. So section 3 is again, I would say it's again a heart of this particular act itself. So it is important to understand section 3. I'll quickly I won't take much time here. Section 3 says, whosoever directly or indirectly attempts to indulge or knowingly assists or knowingly is a party or actually involved in any process or activity connected with the proceeds of crime and projecting or claiming it as untainted property. So proceeds of crime including its concealment, possession, acquisition or use, and projecting it or claiming it as untainted property. So there was an explanation which was added, explanation 1 inserted with effect from 1st August 2019, which says a person involved in any of the following processes in relation to proceeds of crime in any manner whatsoever is guilty under PMLA. So any other processes would be concealment, possession, acquisition, use, projecting as untainted property, claiming as untainted property. Now in section 3 of the PMLA, the following explanation has been inserted, namely, explanation says, for the removal of doubts, it is hereby clarified that a person shall be guilty of offense of money laundering if such person is found to have directly or indirectly attempted to indulge or knowingly assisted or knowingly is a party or is actually involved in one or more of the following processes or activities connected with the proceeds of crime, namely concealment, possession, acquisition, use, or projecting as untainted property or claiming as untainted property in any manner whatsoever. The use of the word or and after the word use leads to the conclusion that a person will be guilty of offense of money laundering when he commits any of the activity mentioned in the explanation. This may be a matter of challenge before the court and can be interpreted in both the ways. Now, there is an explanation 2 which was also inserted with effect from 1st August 2019 in section 3, which says the process or activity connected with the proceeds of crime is a continuity, is a continuing activity and continues till such time a person is directly or indirectly enjoying the proceeds of crime by its concealment or possession or acquisition or use or projecting it as untainted property or claiming it as untainted property in any manner whatsoever. So the flow is, there has to be a scheduled offense. There has to be a scheduled offense. There has to be proceeds of crime. So conditions under section 3 has to be met. And then offense under PMLA is we have committed an offense under PMLA. Now, with this quote, there's something which I wanted every participants, every viewers to be to participate in this understanding it. So in a way, I shouldn't say that I'm testing anybody's knowledge, but it's just that I want everybody to participate in the process of what we have learned till now. So to set exactly what exactly we were thinking of and what exactly and why do we want the people to participate and how, I'll just explain in a few seconds. So with this quote, tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. So if with this quote, I just want to say that in the next slide, we will look at a case study and a question with few options. So we will read the questions together and after that, a pop-up window will open on your screens with the questions and the options. You will get 15 seconds to choose the right option and submit it. After that, another screen will pop up, which will show which option maximum number of people have chosen. After that, I will tell you the right answer and the reasoning behind it. So I thought let everybody be participative and let everybody, now please lend me your ears. I'll read the case study and then that option will be there and then let me see how much everybody is attentive. So of course, nobody would even get to know that who answered what. And so don't worry. So please do poll for it. So case study 1, Mr. A government employee, was charged under the Prevention of Corruption Act 1988 for taking a bribe in a transaction which took place on 1st April 2008. He took the bribe in cash. He had the cash with him on till 31st July 2008. On 1st August 2008, he converted the money into USD through Hawala transaction and got the USD delivered to a person known to him in Dubai. After a few months, he purchased a bungalow in Dubai. Prevention of Corruption Act 1988 was inserted in the schedule of PMLA with effect from 1st June 2009. So now the questions are, whether A has committed the offense of money laundering under PMLA. Options: A, yes, because he has committed an offense under PCA 1988. Option B, yes, because he has committed the offense of money laundering by committing a scheduled offense. Option C, no, because when the illicit money was laundered through Hawala, it was not a proceed of crime under PMLA. So can we have the polls, please? Okay, so the results are there on the screen, which says that 21% have opted for answer A, 55% have answered opted for B, and 24% have opted for C. So, can we have the result? Yeah, the result, and we'll have the correct answer. So the correct answer is C. No, because the illicit money was laundered through Hawala. It was not proceed of crime under PMLA. And principles to be remembered. Thank you so much, everyone, for doing this. Principles to be remembered. While correct answer is C, and of course there are these judgments which supports our contention. Why are we saying C? But there are some fundamental things which we have to remember. So I just explaining the fundamental things. So principles to be remembered while deciding whether the offense is of money laundering under PMLA or not. There are two offenses involved in this case study. First, under Prevention of Corruption Act 1988. Second, under PMLA. So the commission of a scheduled offense is a fundamental precondition for initiating proceedings under PMLA. But mere commission of a scheduled offense does not mean that a person also commits an offense under PMLA. For an offense under PMLA, the conditions stipulated in Section 3 must be fulfilled. In this case, bribe money received by Mr. A is not the proceeds of crime because Prevention of Corruption Act 1988 was not a scheduled offense when Mr. A made the Hawala transaction. The day Mr. A received the bribe, money is irrelevant. So this is important. The day Mr. A received the bribe money is irrelevant for the purposes of PMLA. It is relevant only for Prevention of Corruption Act. So the date when Mr. A laundered the money is relevant for PMLA. So these are basic fundamental principles which one have to remember. Plus, when he laundered the money through Hawala, Prevention of Corruption Act 1988 was not a scheduled offense. Thus, Mr. A cannot be punished under PMLA for the offense of money laundering. This is because being the penal or criminal law, provisions of PMLA cannot be applied retrospectively. These judgments of Karnataka, Kerala and Delhi High Court, they all are to the effect which says that a scheduled offense cannot be declared with retrospective effect. And then they also go on to say that a prosecution under PMLA, the date of money laundering is also very relevant. But we just heard Mr. Sibal saying that after this explanation, after 2019 explanation to section 3, it may be argued that PMLA seems to have a retrospective effect. So this is definitely a subject matter, will be a subject matter of challenge. But so far now is concerned, these judgments definitely tell us that a scheduled offense, which was not there at that particular point of time when the offense was committed, that cannot be declared with a retrospective offense to try that person under PMLA. So that's the end of case study 1. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks a lot. So now proceedings under PMLA. So attachment of property. I'll just be quickly explaining the flow so that now I'm sure since we had heard Mr. Sibal for almost 1 hour, we are aware of the basic nature and basic facts how this particular act moves. So just quickly I'll be touching and then I'll be going to the next case study. So there's a filing of ECR. So he spoke about there are 2 parallel proceedings which can go on. So basically, when there is an ECR which is filed, so there is a proceeding 1 and proceeding 2. Basically, why am I mentioning is because there can be an attachment of property or proceeds of crime by the enforcement directorate, and this attachment can be there for 180 days. And within 30 days, the enforcement directorate has to file a complaint before adjudicating authority, and he will ultimately decide on whether the property has to be released or it has to be subject matter of attachment. Now, when we're talking about proceeding 2, it is basically a criminal trial of money laundering and schedule offense, which is tried by the special court, and the special court has power to convict the accused and confiscate the attached properties. So now attachment of properties, I'm just mentioning the safeguards which are there in section 5. So attachment order can be passed only by director or any officer not below the rank of deputy director authorized by director. The officer must record reasons to believe that any person is in possession of any proceeds of crime which are likely to be concealed, transferred or dealt with in any manner which may result in frustrating proceedings relating to confiscation. The reasons must be based upon the material in his possession, The officer shall forward copy of provisional attachment order along with the material to adjudicating authority. The officer shall, within 30 days of attachment, file complaint with the adjudicating authority for confirmation of provisional attachment. So these are the safeguards. Then what happens after attachment by director under section 5? So the adjudicating authority serves a notice on the person whose property has been attached, calling upon him to indicate the source of his income, earning or assets out of which or by means of which he has acquired the attached property. The adjudicating authority, after considering representation, shall record a finding whether properties are involved in money laundering or not. The attachment shall continue during investigation for a period not exceeding 90 days, amended to 365 days by Act of 7 of 2019, or pendency of criminal proceedings relating to offence under PMLA before competent court. The provisional attachment shall become final on conclusion of the trial and confiscation of the attached property by special court. If on the conclusion of trial, court finds that offence of money laundering has not taken place or property is not involved in the money laundering, it shall release the property. So section 24 is basically burden of proof in any proceedings relating to proceeds of crime under the Act. In case of a person charged with the offence of money laundering under section 3, the authority or court, unless the contrary is proved, presume that such proceeds of crime are involved in money laundering, and in case of any other person, the authority or court may presume that such proceeds of crime are involved in money laundering. Now time for a quick test. This brings us to case study 2. So please be ready. So I'll read the case and then the options, and then we'll have the similar exercise which we have done for case study 1. So here, Mr. A is the proprietor of, I'm reading this very slowly so that everybody listens to it carefully. Mr. A is the proprietor of Messrs. ABC and Sons. An FIR was filed in 2017 against Messrs. ABC and Sons for fraudulently obtaining VAT refund from VAT authorities without actual export of goods in the year 2013. One of the sections under which FIR was filed is section 420 of IPC. Section 420 of IPC is a scheduled offence under PMLA. Thereafter, the ED also registered an ECR against him. In 2017, ED attached the property of Mrs. A and Mr. C, which are situated in India. The property of Mrs. A and Mr. C was purchased in 1991. These properties were mortgaged with SBI, and Mrs. A or Mr. C did not attempt in any manner to dispose of the property. Investigation is pending. Now the question is, and the options are: can ED attach the property of Mrs. A and Mr. C? Options are: option A, no, because they did not commit any scheduled offence, nor were any proceedings initiated against them. Option B, no, because the property was purchased before commission of scheduled offence and before PMLA was enacted. Option C, yes, because they are related to Mr. A. Option D, no, because the properties attached are not proceeds of crime under section 2(1)(u) or derived from proceeds of crime. So can we have the polls, please?
It's great to see so many people taking the poll, Kavita.
And in fact, it's making me feel so happy that everybody has in fact lent their ears, you know,
Yeah.
and the fingers at the moment.
Reminds me of KVC.
So you will be the person who has to, you know, actually declare prize.
Next time onwards, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have the results. So basically, 2% have answered or have opted. Yes. So I'll share the results. 2% have opted for answer A. 24% have answered for option B. 14% have opted for answer C. And 59% for option D. So let's see the answer. So I think we'll go by the people. Let's go by the Janta. So answer is D actually. 59% people have opted for answer D. So answer D is the right answer. No, because the properties attached are not proceeds of crime under section 2(1)(u) or derived from proceeds of crime. The facts of this particular case study is very similar to the facts in the case of Seema Garg versus Deputy Director. This is a Punjab Haryana High Court judgment which was recently decided on 6th March 2020. I'll just explain what the court has said in this. The court has interpreted sections 2(1)(u), section 5 and section 8, held that if the property sought to be attached is not related or derived out of the proceeds of crime of a scheduled offence, then the same cannot be attached under section 5. Property acquired prior to commission of scheduled offence, that is criminal activity, or introduction of PMLA cannot be attached unless property obtained or acquired from scheduled offence is held or taken outside India. However, Delhi High Court has taken a different view in the case of Axis Bank and has given a contrary view. According to me, if you really ask me, Punjab Haryana High Court seems to be a correct view because the properties attached are not the proceeds of crime or was not derived from the proceeds of crime. So, however, since there is a contrary view, there are contradictions and there are two contrary views available now. So, in that sense, it will ultimately Supreme Court will be deciding this issue. So, I'll just quickly say, I'll explain the next procedure. Yeah, so appellate tribunal, basically within 45 days, order made by one can go to the appellate tribunal within 45 days. So within 45 days, order made by one can go to the appellate tribunal. Order made by adjudicating authority and order made by the director against any reporting entity, which could be a bank, financial institution. So within 45 days, appeal has to be filed before the appellate tribunal. So now we come to arrest, bail and trial, because it will be important to know about these provisions as well. So I'll quickly touch upon this. Section 43, 44, 46 and 47, they all deal with the provisions of arrest, bail and adjudication. So section 43, special courts to try offences under PMLA. Section 44, trial of scheduled offence and offence of money laundering together by the same special court, which shall try the same as if it were a court of a session. Section 46, read with section 65, Code of Criminal Procedure, shall apply to proceedings before the special court. And section 47, all appeals from the orders of the special court lie to the jurisdictional high court. Section 44. As per section 44 of the PMLA, offences under the Act is triable by special court, which as per section 43 of the PMLA is a court of session. If the court trying scheduled offence is different from special court trying offence under the PMLA, the court trying scheduled offence shall commit the case to the special court. The jurisdiction of special court under PMLA does not depend on orders passed in respect of scheduled offence, and trial of both offences by same court is not construed as joint trial, although conducted together by special or same court. So bail. Offences under PMLA are non-cognizable and non-bailable. The special court shall take cognizance of offences punishable under section 4 only on complaint in writing made by the director or any officer of the central government or state government authorized by the said government. Section 45, for grant of bail for an offence of money laundering under PMLA, two conditions have to be satisfied. Two conditions have to be satisfied. The public prosecutor has to give an opportunity to oppose the application for such release, and where the public prosecutor opposes the application, the court is satisfied that there are reasonable grounds for believing that he is not guilty of such offence and is not likely to commit any offence on bail. So just, I'll be failing in my duty if I don't mention about Nikesh Tarachand Shah. So I'll just mention about this, a little background about this. So when PMLA was tabled before the parliament, the twin conditions for release on bail applied only to the offence of money laundering under PMLA. However, when the Act was finally notified in 2005, the twin conditions were to be satisfied for both the offences of money laundering and the scheduled offence. Thus, the constitutional validity of section 45 was challenged in the case of Nikesh Tarachand Shah, 2018-11 SSC page 1. In this case, Apex Court had struck down the constitutional validity of this section. Thereafter, by Finance Act 2018, this lacuna in law was corrected. Now, the twin conditions imposed under Section 45(1) have to be satisfied only in the case of bail for offense of money laundering. Now, broad factors considered by the court while granting bail are basically absconding of the accused, tampering of evidence, and influencing of evidence. So, court generally keeps these things, broader aspects in mind, while at the time when they are granting bail. So now, time for a quick test. This brings us to case study 3. So I'll read the case very slowly, and then the options, and then yes, we'll do the same exercise which we have done in case study 2. A raid was conducted by the Anti-Corruption Bureau in the office of Mr. A, a chartered accountant, in September 2015, and an amount of rupees 2.5 crores was seized, recovered from the possession of his co-accused Mr. B and Mr. C. Thereafter, the ACB registered an FIR under IPC 1860 and Prevention of Corruption Act 1988, scheduled offences, punishment for which is 10 years. After completion of investigation, charge sheets were filed against all 3 of the scheduled offences, and thereafter they were enlarged on bail in the scheduled offences. In November 2015, ED registered an ECIR under PMLA. The inquiry of ED continued for 2.5 years. During these 2.5 years, they were never arrested by ED. In July 2018, ED filed a complaint with the special code under PMLA, which summoned all the 3, though non-bailable warrants. After they appeared before the court, they were taken into custody. They applied for bail. The offence under PMLA that they are charged with is punishable for a maximum of 7 years. The amount recovered by ACB is till date in form of an FDR, and it has not been misused by either of the 3 accused. All evidence is in possession of the investigating agencies. A joint trial of both the offence under the schedule and the offence of money laundering is ongoing before the special court. So now the question is, can bail be granted to Mr. A, Mr. B, and Mr. C? Options are A, no, because the schedule offence and the offence under PMLA are separate offences. So there is no need to grant bail under PMLA just because bail has been granted in the schedule offence. Option B, no, because money laundering is a more heinous offence as compared to schedule offences. Option C, yes, since all relevant materials are in possession of ED and the amount seized is also lying in FDR, it is unlikely that the accused will tamper with the evidence. Option D, yes, the accused persons have been granted bail under the schedule offence and the trial of both the cases is being conducted jointly. Option E, both C and D. So can we have the polls, please? Yeah, so results are there. So yes, so I think it's good to see that people have at least tried. So they have answered. So 7% people have said answer A, 4% people have said B, 32% have said C, and 2% have said D. And 55% have said answer E. So I think we'll go again by the Janta. The correct answer is E. Yes. And since I've already told while explaining that, while at the time when bail is granted, there are three things which the courts generally keep in mind. That is, that whether the accused will abscond, number two, whether he will tamper with the evidence, or whether he'll influence the witness. All these three conditions are very important at the time when bail is being granted. So correct answer is C. Both C and D is the right answer. And this fact is also very similar to a recent judgment which was pronounced by Rajasthan High Court in Dhirendra Singh, wherein, of course, it is to be noted that granting of bail is highly subjective and depends on the facts and circumstances of each case. We can't have one straitjacket formula and we can say that we apply this and bail will be granted, because it will again depend on facts and circumstances of each case. But there are some factors broad factors which one have to keep in mind, that these factors are there which courts generally look into and then they grant bail. So these are cases only indicative that, at the time, and this is one more indication one can keep in mind is that once a bail is granted against a scheduled offense, then generally, subject to other factors, court might consider granting bail under PMLA. So this is one I thought I'll just deal with this, that whenever one is dealing with bail issues, one can keep this in mind. Yeah, search and seizure. This is again a very important topic. I'll quickly run through this so that people will have the benefit of this chapter 5. So summon, search and seizure issue also. So basically chapter 5 of PMLA deals with the following sections, which is very similar to our income tax. So, and one thing we have to keep in mind is that every authority have to record reasons in writing before initiating any action under section 16 to 9. So 16 to 19 basically deals with power of survey, search and seizure, power to arrest, retention, presumptions, and then burden of proof. So I'm not dealing with each and every section because this is very similar to our income tax. So now power of survey. Power of survey is specifically dealt in section 16. Here again, reason to believe on the basis of material in possession is very important. Enter any place where an act constituting commission of offence is carried on. Require owner, employ other persons to facilitate and furnish information. Pursuant to survey, the authority may conduct search operations even without the authorization under section 17(1). Now, search and seizure. Now, who can actually initiate it? So, by a director authorizing his subordinate to conduct search of any premise, seize any record, property, examine on oath. Then, on a person committed an act constituting money laundering, possess any proceeds of crime, possess records relating to money laundering, possess any property related to crime. Then search of by the authority when person secreted about his person or any property, record, proceeds of crime, the person has the opportunity to ask the authority to take him to the gazetted officer, magistrate within the next 24 hours. Now, interplay with other laws. So in my last session, I've dealt with Black Money Act. At that particular point in time, I had specifically explained that so far Black Money Act is concerned, like how there can be an interplay between black money and Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Like for example, now when analyzing the interplay between PMLA and BMLA, the impact can be twofold. So information gathered by the authorities while investigating a case under PMLA may be a source for issuing notice under Section 10 of Black Money Act. Or as per Section 88 of Black Money Act, which has been made the offence under Section 51 of BMA as a scheduled offence under PMLA, the investigation under BMLA may lead to investigation under PMLA. So that's how they're interrelated. So since now Prevention of Corruption Act per se is a predicate offence, and now since it's a predicate offence, any information which you get under PMLA can be used for a black money proceeding. So this is how they're interrelated to each other. Now, time for quick test. So this brings us to case study 4. So I'll read the case study very slowly, and then I'll put the option, and we will do the same exercise which we have done in 1, 2, and 3. So yes, case study 4. XYZ Limited is undergoing corporate insolvency resolution process under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016. YUP Limited has been voted as a successful resolution applicant. After due diligence, it has valued XYZ Limited at ₹1,000 crores. It is, however, unaware that many assets of XYZ Limited constitutes proceeds of crime under PMLA. due to money laundering by erstwhile promoters. After approval of the resolution plan, ED attaches the properties which constitutes proceeds of crime. The creditors of XYZ Limited and YUP Limited are taken by surprise with this development. They contended that IBC overrides all other laws. It intends to maximize value for its creditors. Therefore, ED cannot attach or confiscate the property of XYZ Limited under PMLA. So now the question is, can ED attach the properties of erstwhile XYZ Limited after the resolution plan has been approved? Options are A, no, because XYZ Limited ceases to be the owner of the properties once it has been taken over by YUP Limited. B, yes, because the proceedings under PMLA are criminal proceedings. C, no, because post-CIRP action should be taken against the erstwhile management and promoters of XYZ Limited and not YUP Limited or XYZ Limited. D, yes, because the assets of XYZ Limited constitutes proceeds of crime. So can we have the poll, please? Yeah, so the results have now come. So 8% people have opted for option A, 13% have opted for option B, 34% people have opted for answer option C, and 45% people have opted for option D. So this time we can't go by the Janta, the real, and the correct answer is option C. So the correct answer here is option C. No, because action should be taken against the erstwhile management and promoters of XYZ Limited and not YUP Limited or XYZ Limited post CIRP. The facts of this case are similar to the recent judgment of NCLAT, JSW Limited and others versus Mahendra Kumar Khandelwal and others decided on 17 February 2020, which relates to insolvency proceedings of Bhushan Steel and Power Limited. In its order dated 17 February 2020, NCLAT held that IBC overrides PMLA when it comes to protecting the corporate debtor and the resolution applicant. However, ED can still proceed against erstwhile management and promoters. I just wanted to tell little facts of this particular case, and in fact want to even quote from the stand of Union of India, which they took. So just allow me to explain this in little detail, because this issue is this issue has given rise to a lot of gray areas, which I'll be delving upon. I'll be explaining what are the gray areas which it has given rise to. So the stand of the Union of India through MCA is, if I just allow me to quote and read this particular portion, if any corporate debtor is undergoing investigation by the Central Bureau of Investigation, Serious Fraud Investigation, and or the Directorate of Enforcement Directorate, such investigations are separate and independent of the corporate insolvency resolution process under the IBC, and both can run simultaneously and independent of each other. It is further submitted that the erstwhile management of a company would be held responsible for the crimes, if any, committed under the regime, and the new management taking over the company after going through the IBC process cannot be held responsible for the acts of commission and commission of the previous management. In other words, no criminal liability can be fixed on the successful resolution applicant or its officials. So this was the stand of the MCA. So it is also said that after completion of the CIRP, that is statutory process, under the IBC, there cannot be any attachment or confiscation of the assets of the corporate debtor by any enforcement agencies after approval of the resolution plan. The ED, however, took a contrary view. So let's understand what was the view of ED. Due to this opposing positions taken by the wings of central government, the execution of resolution plan was stayed by NCLAT. However, NCLAT did not observe that if the assets are seized by the Enforcement Directorate and is finally held that the assets were purchased out of the proceeds of crime, in such case, the amount as may be generated out of the assets will come within the meaning of operational debt payable to the Enforcement Directorate, for which it may file claim in terms of Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016. The matter was adjourned and an ordinance making further amendment in the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code dated 2016, 20 December 2019 inserted section 32A, which protected the corporate debtor from any liabilities of PCIRP. The new section further protected the assets of the corporate debtor too. On a specific query raised by the NCLAT, the MCA stated that JSW Steel Limited gets the protection of the new section 32A. The ED still took an opposite view. So in its order dated 17 February 2020, NCLAT held that IBC overrides PMLA when it comes to protecting the corporate debtor and the resolution applicant. However, ED can still proceed against the erstwhile management and the promoters. So issue is not resolved. So far as of now is concerned. Now, there are some unanswered questions, I thought I'll flag this issue because these issues are going to be there. So the questions which now comes, when you're reading these kind of judgments, then, excuse me. So issue number one, whether the assets attached by the Enforcement Directorate forms part of the liquidation state of the corporate debtor or not. Issue number two, whether assets already attached can be included in the resolution plan. Issue three, what happens to the assets covered under the personal guarantee, which are acquired through proceeds of crime? To what extent can banks lay their hands on such assets? These are the questions which will necessarily come and arise. So as of now, if you really ask, so to answer to all these questions will depend on which of the two legislation is supreme. Now, we know as per section 238 of Insolvency Bankruptcy Code, it specifically mentions that it will override all other laws. So objective of IBC, if you really ask me, it's to maximize the value of assets for various stakeholders, especially creditors. Now, being a the law is well settled that if there are two central legislation and the law which came later in point of time, that should have, and that will have an overriding effect, and that will prevail over the one which came earlier. So now in taking that cue from this particular argument, we can say that being a statute enacted after PMLA, IBC has precedence over PMLA when it comes to interpreting these particular provisions. But the question is now, again, this also brings to another question. So, but the question is whether this would extend to criminal law, because this criminal law per se is, where the rights are stake are their rights in rem. So they are not rights in personam. So will this be applicable to criminal laws as well? Because PMLA, the laws which will come within the ambit of PMLA would be in the category of criminal law. So these questions therefore have to be tested before the Apex Court, before arriving at any conclusive answers. Because these are the issues which are going to arise, and this is a problem which we can foresee. And so this, according to us, this is how one can interpret, but this has to be ultimately interpreted and tested in court of law. There is one miscellaneous provision, miscellaneous issues, and one miscellaneous provision I thought I'll bring to everybody's notice, which is section 63. So section 63, basically it's punishment for false information or failure to give information. So section 63, any person willfully and maliciously giving false information and causing an arrest or a search to be made under this act shall on conviction be liable for imprisonment for a term which may extend to 2 years, or with fine which may extend to 50,000 rupees or both, if any person being legally bound to state the truth of any matter relating to an offence under section 3 refuses to answer any questions put to him by an authority in the exercise of its power under this act, or refuses to sign any statement made by him in the course of any proceedings under this act which an authority may legally require to sign, or to whom a summons is issued under section 50, either to attend, to give evidence, or produce books of account or other documents at a certain place and time, omits to attend or produce books of accounts or documents at the place of time, he shall pay by way of a penalty a sum which shall not be less than 500 rupees, but which may extend to 10,000 rupees for each such default or failure. So this is an important, because this is basically for malicious prosecution. People who are falsely and willfully and maliciously giving information in a could be a case of a blackmailing, could be anything. So one has to keep in mind this particular section, which will come in aid. So this brings me to end of my presentation. I thought I try to make it as concise as possible. And I end with this particular quotation, and I won't read it. I would want people to read and then think about it.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for this absolutely exciting and enthralling session. I think the use of the polls, I think made the session extremely interactive. So, ma'am, before we take the questions of the participants, Bharti wants to pose one or two questions to you.
Sure.
So I hand it over to Bharti, ma'am.
Yeah. Thanks, Kavita, for this insightful discussion. I have only one question.
Yeah.
Can you throw some light on PMLA trigger in demonetization cases?
Yeah, sure, Bharti. So, in most cases, the FIR is filed by the police under section 420 of IPC, read with section 120. That's the most of the situation we see. Now, section 420 of IPC deals with cheating and dishonestly inducing delivery of property, right? That's the section which talks about it. Now, offenses under both these sections are scheduled offenses under PMLA, and that's a good enough reason for ED to initiate investigation. No problem. Now, sometimes after further investigation reveals that offenses under other scheduled offenses have also been committed. For example, let's take an example. The money being deposited into bank accounts may be earned through bribery, which will attract a charge under the Prevention of Corruption Act. Similarly, if the persons being charged are bank managers, as they would also invariably fall into the folds of Prevention of Corruption Act, which is again a scheduled offense. So PMLA also imposes obligation on banking entities, financial institutions, maintain and disclose information about the identity of its clients and beneficial owners. So there is also further obligation to assist in investigation. This further helps in investigation of demonetization cases. Now, we have to keep in mind that in cases of demonetization, once the proceedings under PMLA starts, the principles relating to bail attachment remain the same. So, once there is an investigation by police and ED, other departments like Income Tax Department also conduct search and seizure proceedings. So that's how it has become now interrelated, and that's how they have to be understood in that sense.
Oh, thanks, Kavita. Just one more question, Kavita. I know you have the PMLA vis-a-vis IBC Act, but one question is, can the assets of a corporate debtor be attached by ED during moratorium under IBC?
Yeah, see, the purpose of moratorium is mainly to keep the assets of the corporate debtor together during insolvency proceedings. So this is further to ensure maximization of value of assets. So, however, section 14 of IBC, if you see, which talks about moratorium, does not specifically bar attachment by agencies of the government. More so when the attachment is only provisional. Attachment till the trial of the offense of money laundering. Money laundering is complete. So we have seen that, these are only provisional attachment. So there is no bar per se in that sense.
Thanks, Kavita.
Yeah, there is one case, I think, if I remember, of Kolkata bench of, in the case of Ray Agro, which was decided in 2018, wherein NCLT held that the assets attached by the ED be handed over to the liquidator. So this is not unheard of in that sense.
Perfect.
Ma'am, I'll now take the questions of the participants.
Sure.
Okay, so ma'am, the first question is whether PMLA can be invoked without being convicted of the scheduled offense.
Yes, yes. There is no bar on that. You don't have to be convicted. Investigation will start.
Okay. Ma'am, one more question is what is the difference between possession versus confiscation under PMLA? What happens to the voting rights in the case of shares? Like who can get ad vote on the shares?
Possession or attachment?
Ma'am, possession versus confiscation.
So shares have been confiscated or shares have been attached?
So they want to know the difference between that actually. So what is
Shares
the
have been,
difference? Yeah, difference between confiscation and possession under PMLA.
basic attachment versus confiscation, isn't it? If I've understood the question properly, it should be attachment versus confiscated. So if your shares are attached, it is attached for a temporary person. Oh, earthquake. Is it? There's an earthquake. There's an earthquake.
Oh.
There's an earthquake. Just a sec. We have to
No
pause.
problem, ma'am. No problem. No problem at all.
Then I rise. Close. Close. So whatever questions are there, you can send. I think we'll have to wind up.
Sure, ma'am. Sure. Definitely. Okay, ma'am. I'll make you the questions. I'll compile them and mail them to you.
Please
Okay.
mail the question. You send the question.